requirement of if something needs to be replaced on the holistic view of that? Who's put it through building control for that? So if we look at what is notifiable, if it's a change to their fire safety provisions, or you have to update the fire safety information, it then is notifiable. Well, when it becomes notifiable, the work has to go through the process of notifiable work. So I think many people...
Yeah, Lee, can I stop you for a minute? Because otherwise I'm encroaching on Barry's time. The main reason I just wanted to raise it was I think yours is a really good use case for being able to use 360s. So we can perhaps pick up on that towards the end of the session, if that's all right, Lee.
Yeah, no problem.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hey, how you doing? Okay.
Barry, do you want to get underway?
Yeah, sure. Hi guys, thank you for joining. It's quite a few people here, and it's great. We're very it's great to have a great audience, and hopefully we're going to give you some information today which is going to be useful for you, but also helpful for you to convey to your bosses and your clients, because it's actually quite often them who need to know about this. As there'll be as we're going through, there'll be if you want to put any questions in the chat line, and then we'll come to those at the end. We'll have about 10-minute question and answer session, and I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. It's a fairly big subject. On the face of it, it looks straightforward, but as you'll see, there's lots of considerations, and we're going to go through that. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, if that's all right. Where am I? I'm allowed to, have I got permission to share my screen? Oh yeah, hold on a sec. Where am I? Can everybody see my,
yeah, you can see.
You can see my PowerPoint presentation, can you?
Not yet, no. Can see what's on your screen though, which is
okay,
you're showing
that's
everybody
fine.
else.
That'll work. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
No, you're actually on the chat screen, Barry.
Sorry?
You're on the chat screen.
I'm on the chat screen. How am I doing that? Hold on a minute. Right, okay. Right, sorry about that. Okay, can you see my
That's
you got
right,
it?
yeah.
Oh, great, sorry about that. Okay, so right, so why 360 imagery? Why is it so important? Or just a bit of background for you so you understand where I'm coming from. I've been doing 360 imagery and asset management for 25 years. So I'm coming at it from a point of view of all the mistakes I've made. Hopefully you won't make them. And try and give you an introduction as to what you may need to think about for 360. So why is it so important for something like asset management? For me, it does a number of different things. It allows you to look at the complete visual context. Where is it? What's it in relation to? What other associated products are there? And it uses fairly simple technology to actually show that. Basic cameras, some basic photographic skills, and we'll go through some of the myths and legends shortly. It's pretty low cost equipment. We're not talking about, many mega thousands of stuff, and very easy to get into. It's also crucially easy for IT delivery. It's not going to give your IT manager a heart attack when you say that you want to do this, because an awful lot of the stuff doesn't necessarily impact his workflow. It also allows you to have use it as a portable platform as well. You can use 360 as a way of taking your plant and viewing it from anywhere, but also view it on the plant as well. So you can actually walk around with this sort of visual asset management system and populate it from your tablet or your phone. Crucially for me, it allows you to collaborate at any skill level. If anyone who can fog up a mirror can use Google Street View, and I've got people using it from the CEO down to the basic technician. But overall, I think the key for me is the way it communicates with immediacy. As they say, a picture tells 1,000 words. 360 does a lot more than that. And rather than writing lots of reams and reams of word and text backwards and forwards, just showing people makes life a lot easier. Okay, so one of the things we need to think about, so what we're trying to do with this is ask questions. And the key issue is we're asking 3 questions from the photograph. Where on the planet is it taken? And where specifically in the building? Because we're looking at context and this idea of putting things into 3D. We are hardwired to think in 3D. If I asked all of you where you've left your car keys, you create a 3D model in your brain and you go and retrieve it. We are hardwired to think in 3D, and we're hardwired to think in space as well. So 360 is a simple way of delivering that. But what are we doing these photographs for? Well, basically, most of the photographs are trying to ask the question, what has changed? Okay, well, so we might take a snapshot, but then we may want to see how things have changed over a period of time. That might be dilapidation, or it might be before a repair or after a repair. Because without understanding that the lifetime of an asset, it's very difficult for us to manage. So that's one of the key aspects. We're answering the question when. And the other thing is, what is it a photograph of? We've got 360 imagery, and but what's in it? And there's no point just having a 360 image with a file name. That's useless. We need to know the content. Otherwise, we could spend ages and ages looking through photographs of files without finding the right one. So what we're going to do in the next hour or so, 45 minutes, is try and address some of these exactly, and also look at the a few other things. So what I want to do first off is dispel some of the myths. Before we get on, the challenge of 360 imagery is it is 360. Okay, so we're capturing lots of things we don't necessarily want to capture. If I'm taking a photograph with my iPhone or my normal phone, the camera does some special averaging and gives you the ideal exposure. Looking in one direction. The problem with 360 is you get different lighting conditions. I've got the sun coming over my shoulder. I've got a ceiling void that's unlit. So what we get there is glare and overexposure, and details can be hidden in the shadows. The good news is that we can cope with all those. We also get things like people capture. Now, the camera itself is operated by someone. The person is likely to be in it unless we have a special bracket or a special procedure. Again, we can overcome that. But the other thing as well, it gathers information that we need to fix, like faces. And one of the things we need to do legally in some circumstances is remove those faces and blur them. Good news, again, there's easy ways to do that. And the other issue we've got is security and security capture. Are we capturing security equipment that might not necessarily want to be shared? So we have to limit access to these. But also there's simple things like, every one of us has probably moved house and seen 360 tours. The police will tell you they hate them because basically it's given the burglar the eye opener of it allows you to case the joints from Rightmove. Okay, so there are certain things to think about with security. Okay, but what I want to do is sort of get some of the myths of 360 out of the way and debunk some of them. Okay, so I hear this a lot, and it's largely because people don't know what they don't know, which is absolutely fair enough. But first off, you can't take accurate measurements with 360. The reality is, while a single 360 image alone might only yield approximate visual measurements, it's a critical component when you integrate it with other technologies, like combined with photogrammetry, we use multiple overlapping images, or LiDAR scanning. So you can generate highly accurate 3D models and point clouds from which you can get precise engineering grade measurements or survey grade measurements from it. Now, in most cases, you don't need that. We're just looking at taking photographs of what is there, but you can do this if you have the right workflow. The other one is 360 images are just for marketing, for virtual tours and entertainment. Well, we've seen those, you've seen it. If you go to Rightmove to buy a house, you'll have a virtual tour. You'll have someone sticking a 360 helmet on the ski helmet or the canoe blade or whatever. They're perfectly valid, but it goes a lot. That's what we call prosumer cameras. And it's great to do that, but it's much, much more. It's popular, but it replies, for me, they also gives you a robust and reliable, verifiable documentation. It gives you the ability to do remote inspection, automate things like progress tracking. It gives you detailed condition monitoring, and it also allows you to create really comprehensive what we might call training and reference materials. Okay, next one, capturing 360 imagery is difficult and requires specialized photographic training. No, my mum, who's 86, does some of it. It's not that hard. There are certain things you need to think about, and I can teach anybody to do 360 imagery in a very short period of time, to be able to cope with dark spaces, light spaces, working in confined spaces and things like that. The next thing I hear is stitching. Some people think the stitching is perfect or is terrible and visible, and so it doesn't look very nice. Well, the point is, if you know what you're doing and you know the right tools to use, stitching can be almost perfect and you don't necessarily see it. Right, the other one, 360 imagery replaces human inspection or traditional surveying methods. I don't think that's true at all. I think what it does is it augments those subject matter experts. It enables remote pre-screening. So you can just value, most people can see a fire extinguisher or a fire alarm, but it may need subject matter experts to add the detail to it. But it at least gives you a preliminary, fast, quick way of looking at things. And then you can allocate resources to that later on and add the subject matter expertise to it. What do I have? Well, okay, the next one will be, well, let's have a think. Yeah, so 360 video. Okay, so there's two aspects to 360 imagery. We can use video or imagery, and we're going to come later on about when you choose which. And people say 360 video isn't good enough, it's too complex and you can't search it. Well, it's true, but there are ways that you can use 360 video excellently, and it produces fabulous results and can be the difference between a job working and not. So some people talk about 360 video and worry about it, but actually it's a great addition to it. So let's go on to some more of these myths, and then we'll get onto some of the nitty gritty. All 360 cameras produce the same quality of image. Not true. You can get things like a prosumer device for a couple £100 and go way up to 50, 60,000 pounds if you want to. However, the main issue really is which camera do you use that's appropriate for the job. Okay, if I'm doing documentation of a cathedral with 360 imagery, I'm not going to use a cheap 360 camera I'd stick on my skateboard. Okay, so understanding that there are different cameras for different purposes, and we're going to come on to that in the next phase, is really important. A lot of people I hear, there's a lot of, I've heard this in conversations, the 360 imagery has no place in what we might call the established BIM world, or, you know, other things to do with COBie, etc., etc. Working by itself, yeah, no, you're right. But if you work alongside these things, then you've got the ability to apply what we might call the really robust, strong metadata conventions and practices. And we can also adhere to standards like COBie. So what we get is a seamless linking of this immersive environment with the spreadsheet, which is much easier to communicate to our procurement people, to our FM people. If they can see what you're talking about, and it's not just a number or an asset name, it makes life a lot easier, and it's easier to communicate complex ideas or maintenance issues or things like that. So for me, it's the missing link between, I think it's the missing link between BIM and FM, or it could be, as an interesting discussion for later on. Also, I hear people say it's impossible to capture 360 images in places like in dark spaces, you know, like roof spaces or things like that. That's complete rubbish. You can do, and I can show you how you do that. You can use 360. The only limitation on 360 is the minimum focus distance on the camera. Obviously, if I'm trying to put it down a drain pipe, that's not going to work. But I could put it in a 1 meter culvert or something like that, and I'm still going to be able to make it work. You've just got to know a bit about photography and the camera you choose. The other thing I hear is 360 data is too large to manage, store, and share effectively. I think this is the biggest single thing I come across. There must be dozens, hundreds, even thousands of 360 cameras sat in drawers. doing nothing, because people have bought it and thought this is a panacea, it's a magic bullet. Well, the camera is just the first part. The much more interesting thing for me is what do you do with it later on? How do you find it? How do you store it? How do you share it? Because you might be taking thousands of 360 images of your asset, but they're no good if you can't find what you're looking for. So there are simple strategies to allow you to do that, and we'll just give you a little cover with that later on. The other last one is you need costly high-end equipment to get valid 360 data. No, you don't. I mean, this is something you can do mostly with your phone. You could do it with your iPhone. If you want to do it that way, it's not the ideal piece of kit, but you certainly can. But you can spend a lot of money on more expensive systems. And that's really, you know, it depends on the type of job you're doing. If I'm documenting a city and I want to do it with 360 cameras, I can do that. But if I'm documenting a phone box, I could do that too. Okay. You don't need, it is not like you need to spend a lot of money like on a LiDAR laser scanning system. You can do it for less than it, well, for a couple of £100, and you can equip everybody in your organization with the same camera and adopt that very easily. And that's probably where the benefits come, is the more people use 360, the more people are going to benefit, and the more your organization and all your stakeholders, your clients, your customers, your procurement suppliers, your supply chain. Because it's not just about you, it's about using 360 to communicate right across the board with all your stakeholders and partners. Right, so, okay, now let's go on to this camera. So give me one, I'd have a quick slurp, and I'm on time, actually. Right, so there are basically three sorts of cameras you can use. There's a camera which I call the one shot. Now these are like going from top, you've got on these photographs, you've got the GoPros, you've got the Ricos, you've got the Insta360s. These are what I would call prosumer devices. They really came from sort of the leisure market, really. And consequently, because they're in the leisure market, they're really designed for quick shooting, not long-term shooting and stuff. Excellent quality, range from price from a couple of $100 to $1,000. And they are what we call one shot. They use a twin lens, one looking forwards and one looking backwards. And they stitch these images together mechanically, looking at the calibration that they get from the image capture device. Most of them, you can get them in 360 video or static images, and there are different times you would use each of those. The idea really is they're simple and they're portable. You can put this in your back pocket, you can put it in your briefcase, very simple. You're not walking around with big expensive kit that attracts attention. It's very simple and everyone can use them. I mean, some of these things you can almost like a wallet size. They're simple and portable. However, there are some limitations with them. If you're doing a lot of asset management jobs. If I'm just going out to do a photograph of a house or one property, perfectly fine. But if I'm going to document a paper mill or a nuclear plant or a school or a hospital, may not be the ideal tool. It will do it for you, but there's some limitations. Those limitations are they're limited by the light conditions they can operate in. They're minimal, what we call HDR, high dynamic range. So if you've got bright sunlight or dark areas, it's difficult in a 360 image to get all that perfectly exposed. So you'll have glaring, you'll have bits that are missing. You've always got the operator visibility error in the visibility probability, because someone's got to hold it, and it's a 360 camera, so you or your stick or your tripod or something might be in the way. And quite a lot of people use the press, timer release, run away and hide method, which is perfectly valid, but extremely slow and not really good if I'm in a sports hall or on that long corridor with locked doors, like I did last year in a prison. Couldn't use that. Good news is you don't have to use that. You can remove yourself from it. We'll come to that later on in some field tips we've got. For me, the issue really for these is just the battery life. If I'm going out and doing lots of work, the battery life isn't that great. So you've constantly got to keep them charged up or find a place to charge them up and then charge them up again, because an awful lot of them don't have removable batteries. It's inbuilt. So while they're great for short-term bursts, they can be a bit of a problem. Okay. The other issue is what you do with the image storage and transfer. Now, an awful lot of these use an iPhone or an Android app, and then you download the images onto that on your phone, and then you've got to move themselves otherwise. Some have built-in SD cards, which means you can just take it out, store the SD card, put another one back in, which is much the better way. If it hasn't got an SD card, I wouldn't touch it because it's just going to drive you nuts. And then the other problem you've got is image management. You're going to be taking lots and lots of photographs. Where in that building is it? You're in a plant room, you've got lots of photographs of pipe work. Whereabouts is that? Okay, you're going down a corridor or a high-rise building. Which floor are you on? And the only way you can figure that out is by actually opening up an image and reading the number on the door or the number on the boiler or something like that. So in terms of image management, these will get you out of jail. They're great systems to doing short things. But if I, like me, were doing 360 imagery of big buildings, schools, hospitals, factories, council offices, there are other systems I would probably use. But to be fair, I've always got one of these in my bag because they're great for infill and all sorts of other things. The second sort of camera is a one-shot, or what we call one-shot mobile. Okay, now these are sort of at the big end. If I want to do 360 of a whole park or a town or a university campus or something like that, externals, you have these mobile systems, and these are quite expensive, but they save you hours. And you can mount them on a vehicle, on your car, you can mount them on your bicycle, a Segway, on your all-terrain vehicle, even seen them on a golf buggy. One of the more interesting applications I've got at the moment is mounting them on wheelchairs for looking at wheelchair or disability access mapping, which I think is a fabulous application for this. But then you can apply it on not unnamed, Barry, just type properly. It's unmanned, it should be. Sorry about that. So you can look at things remotely and mount it on a drone, on a boat, or a thing to go under a culvert or a drain or something like that. So those are multi-shots, and what they're taking is they give you much more resolution. They have some limitations as well, and that they're not great, not great at coping with a big dynamic range. But at the same time, if I want to map a disaster zone after a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that, that's what you would go. So these are the high end. But then we come on to probably the camera that I personally use the most, which is what we call multi-shot. A multi-shot basically is any camera with an interchangeable lens. And then you'll put that onto a nodal ninja or a nodal bracket, which means you rotate it around in different positions and you get overlapped images. Okay, now that sounds like a bit of a pain, but trust me, actually, it can be as quick as just a one shot because you're not having to run away. You are always behind the camera, so you're never in the shot. So you don't have to press the button and run somewhere to hide. So if you use that, you've already got one benefit, but there are more benefits about using a different sort of camera. So it's any camera. It can be a APC, a small point and shoot camera, or it can be a much bigger, more expensive professional grade, where you get much higher resolution and much better dynamic range. The advantage that you've got, it gives you a complete 360. There's no area it won't take. So you've got complete 360, which also includes the tripod and the roof space, and you're getting a great image that's consistent both for lighting and definition right the way across. They also allow you to do what I call hybrid shooting, so you can mix video and static images. So you can record a video of a certain area and then use 360 imagery from that. And static images, so you can mix them both, and sometimes just having a video of you opening the box or doing something, showing how that you can use the same camera for recording instructions or evacuation routes or a zillion other things. It can also cope with any lighting conditions. So I use this to do tunnels at night in the middle of the country that's unlit, to brights. I do a lot of heritage work, so in the deserts of Jordan, bright summer sunshine. So we can cope with lots of what we call dynamic range in the same scene, bright sun shining over my shoulder into a dark space, which a normal camera and certainly one of the one-shot ones wouldn't be able to deal with. The other issue is these are designed really, so battery life and storage are really easy to manage because most have removable batteries. So you keep your batteries on charge. It takes 5 seconds to replace it. You're not stopping. You don't have to wait. And also you've got much higher memory storage. The system I use has 2 SD cards. I can shoot all day and I don't have to worry about that. And that could be thousands of images. It has much higher resolution because you can get like Sony high-end ones at 61 megapixel for every image. And sometimes you can stitch like 18 or 19 images together. So you can imagine, well, I'll show you an example of that shortly. It also allows you to do what we call a tethered solution. What do I mean by that? You can attach your computer or your iPad to this and use that to remotely control it. And also importantly, to rename files as you're taking them. So I can normally, when you get these, when you get the image file, it's just a list of meaningless numbers. But what you can do if you have a tethered solution, you can say, this is room 2104. This is the corridor. This is floor 5. So you can actually name the image relevant to what it is, where it is. Now, this sounds a little trivial, but trust me, it saves you hours and hours and hours of time, because ordinarily what you have to do if you don't have this is you have to open every single image to see where it was, because the number by itself doesn't mean anything. Okay, there are other strategies that we can go to which will help you with that. But the other thing about a tethered solution, it requires, you can actually use it for remote operation as well. So I can attach my phone to it. I can attach, so if I want to stick something on a pole up into a suspended ceiling or a void, or lower it down into confined spaces like a manhole or inspection cover under computer flooring above suspended ceilings, I can do that and see exactly what I'm getting a photograph of. The downside, if it is a downside of these, the benefits and field capture are immense, but you also require things. So you require some image post-processing software. Why do you need that? Well, you need to, the beauty of these cameras is you can recover detail in the shadows, dull highlights, and do things like segmentation, just isolate particular colors. That's a long involved thing, but it really can be really important sometimes. So you would need a software like Lightroom or Capture One, and I'll show you briefly Capture One in a minute, just so I'll show you some examples. It also requires some sort of stitching software. Now there's plenty of those about. The good news is none of these are expensive anymore. I mean, most of them are on monthly subscription. Lightroom's about 25, Capture One's about 25. The stitching software there's the subscription or online things you can do. I wouldn't recommend them, but things like PT GUI and stuff is sort of like the godfather of stitching, and you can sort out pretty well any problem with PT GUI. That's several £100, but it's worth its weight in gold because you're going to get good quality imagery. And then you also need something to cope with what we call batch processing. There's no point, you're going to have thousands of photographs that you may want to process during the year, or even just for one job. I mean, we've got one school that I'm doing at the moment, or one paper mill I've just done, that was over 500 spherical 360 imagery. And I needed to tweak images on those. So having batch processing is critically important, but the good news is batch processing is facilitated by Lightroom and Capture One and PT GUI as well. So which camera would I use? Okay, well, I've always got two. I've got a standard one shot, which I use for infill, and I use a Sony A7R4 because that allows me to go to the nth degree or not, depending on what I need. However, it really depends on the type of work you're doing. If you want to give 360 imagery or 360 camera to the surveyor who's going out, or going out to look at a house or something, you don't need this expensive camera. But if I was documenting a power station or a factory or a school, I'm probably more inclined to use one of these. Okay, right. So next phase is right. The other one we should mention, of course, is the Matterport type cameras where you combine camera and LiDAR. Okay, now Matterport has been given a lot of prominence, and almost to the point where people say, oh, I want a Matterport tour, which is brilliant. I mean, I love the cameras. If I'm selling a property, they're great. but there are some problems with them. Okay, and there is, I say, life beyond Matterport. There are other competitive cameras to Matterport, but there's some things you need to think about if you're using Matterport and type camera. And if you've got one, that's not a problem. You can use them. It's just if you're buying something else in the future, something to reflect on. The LiDAR combined with the camera produces what we might call a low-grade point cloud. It's not bad, okay, but it's not what you might call survey grade. It's not going to give you accuracy down to a centimeter, but in many cases, do you need it? That's another question. It also provides you with a flow from the point cloud to produce a dimensional model, a 3D dimensional model, or you can actually use it to trace and get 2D drawings where you don't have them. Now, hopefully you've got them, but in many, many cases, 85% of the world's building stock was pre-Revit. So, and there may be old drawings if they're available or not disappeared. But if I've got to reconstruct 2D drawings so I can position my 360 imagery, it's a great way of doing it. The problem is that the camera struggles to cope with dynamic range and has a limited resolution range. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's great up to a few meters, but if I want to do something like a sports hall or something like that, it's going to degrade quite a lot. So it's great if I'm doing small buildings, small rooms and things like that. But when I get to big spaces, it struggles with that. And it certainly struggles with trying to stitch things if it's outside when the wind's blowing. Okay. It's also quite an expensive solution if I want to host for long-term assets. It's great for short-term. If I want to sell a property and I need to have a 360 picture available to lots of people for a short period of time, it's perfect. Okay, but not necessarily if I've got a long-term PFI contract or even just facilities management. I'm not looking at something I'm going to have to keep paying month and month and month for. The advantage of the previous two types of camera is you can control the copyright. Okay, and the problem you've got with things like Matterport and some of the other things is all the images on the models are processed using their software as a service. So in many cases, as soon as you press the Matterport button or upload it, you become almost like an employee of Matterport. You have to get permission or they charge you for doing that. Now that's one problem, but the other problem is more fundamental with some clients, and that's to do with where these things are hosted, to do with governance and jurisdiction. Okay, where is this data hosted? Is it in a place that I can sue people if data goes down or it's transferred or the owner of that data center changes? And there's also issues to do with copyright and intellectual property issues. One interesting point about copyright is as soon as you or your employee presses that shutter on that camera of the previous two types, you own the copyright. Okay, you're not giving it away. And that's one of the things. So the benefits of easy software as a service things, so 360 processing, remote processing can be immense. But you have to remember that you may not necessarily own the copyright of those things. Okay, and that might be important to your clients. Okay, and to do with if I'm doing, for example, I'm doing a factory. Okay, the client may necessarily not want that to be shared anywhere because of intellectual property, special machinery they've got and things like that. Okay, so there's the camera, and I'm just going to move on to a few field tips. Because I've tried, and for me, the biggest issue is how can I make this as cost effective and efficient as possible? And there's two aspects to this. There's what you do in the field with the camera, and then probably the more interesting and the more costly part of it is what you do with those images once you've got them. Okay, so a couple of things just to reflect on. Excuse me, I'll have a bit of a slurp. I think we're all right for time. I haven't looked at any of the questions, by the way, if you've got them, so we'll come to that later on. So my apologies, but I wanted to try and get everything done, and then we can come to the questions later on, if that's all right. So things about tips, some things about camera placement. I'm a bit of a lazy guy. I want to do the least amount of work to get the most amount of coverage. So actually using a 360 is quite a bit of an art. What you want to do is do the less photographs as possible, but with the maximum coverage. So what you get then, and you'll find this as soon as you start doing 360, it'll convert into your life. You'll be sitting at tables in restaurants going, can I see every surface from here? Okay, it's a bit like, you know, I don't know, a spy thriller, so you can get the view. You become a different sort of, you need to plan what your route is going to be. And 5 minutes walking around, you know, on a site, on a building before you do it saves you loads of problems later on. I walk around and sometimes I've got a piece of chalk and I go, right, this is the best place where I can see every surface I need to, and things that are hidden behind a pipework or a cabinet or things like that, which may be really important for asset management. So you become a bit of an artist and a bit of a line of sight expert, really. So if you are a surveyor, land survey, you've already got that inbuilt because that's what you do. But if you're doing 360, you become an expert on the minimum number of points of photographs you have to take to cover the maximum number of surfaces. So spend a little bit of time, walk around with a piece of chalk and put an X marks a spot. Tops, I don't know what that, oh, it's tripods. Sorry about the typo. I was doing this quite quick just because it was the last slide I did. Tripods and monopods really are non-negotiable, really, because once you're using static imagery, if you're working in low light, you are not going to be able to hold the camera steady enough in your hand so it's not going to be blurry. Now, the good news is there are a wide variety of things that you use. In the training courses we do, we go through a whole series of these. It can be something really simple, like an extendable thing, or it can be a proper camera tripod, depending on what it is and how strong your muscles are. But you're going to need a tripod or a monopod, and that's just non-negotiable, because otherwise you're just going to produce photographs that you're going to be really disappointed in. Releases and remote releases and stuff. One of the things you'll find is that you don't want to press the shutter, and you'll get a lot of people will know about this. If you can't hold the camera in your hand for, you know, more, if the exposure in a dark area is going to be more than about a 60th of a second. So, but what you can do is use mobile phone apps, so you can walk around the corner and trigger it, or you can hard cable it. I always use a hard cable because I always find my mobile phone apps crunch. They just, as soon as you start connecting mobile phones to remote cameras, 360 cameras, every time someone has a data surge, you seem to be thrown off. So you're constantly having to, in some cases, constantly having to reconnect. I try and use a cable release, but then I'm using a multi-shot camera in most cases. Probably the biggest tip I would suggest is you need a pocket full of door wedges. Okay, now before everybody says, oh, you're not allowed to wedge open fire doors, I get that. But there's lots of doors where you've got to get overlap and shoot through. And sometimes putting the camera in the doorway is the best way to help navigation. So with the caveat of, please don't put door wedges under fire doors that can't remain open. Okay, I'm sure none of us ever done that. The door wedges in your pocket is a really useful, banal piece of kit. I'd also say a piece of chalk or a marker you can put on the floor, just so you know you've got coverage. So if you have to come back to a photograph, you know where you've got it. Obviously, chalk, don't put permanent markers on there because people get very upset with that. And then the last thing to do is operator removal. Now, for me, it's not frustration, it's just that there are ways to get you out of the camera shot. So if I've got a 360 camera image, I press the shutter release. Now you can put a time delay on of 2, 5, 10 seconds to give you time to go and hide behind a corner so you're not in it. But that's incredibly slow. So there are ways you can mitigate that. One of the ways of doing it, and we can talk about this in more detail, and probably anyone who's interested in it, there's probably about a 20 or 30 minute crash course in this that probably can cover it. But by doubling the number of images, so taking one when you're on one side and one when you're on the other, there are some simple scripts and simple methods which will mean you just join the two sides of the image that you are not in. Now, if you're using multiple image stuff, then you're always behind. So the operator removal issue doesn't arise. And trust me, that saves an awful lot of time, because I can just click, move the camera. I don't have to click, run away, hide, and then come back. In my estimation, it improves the rate. It at least doubles or trebles the number of images you can do in a day if you go down one of these routes. And I'm happy to sit and talk about that till the cows come home, because it's one of those annoying things that I see people doing all the time. And I go, well, why are you doing that? Okay, so some field tips we'll look at, hopefully a logism, but there's some more things we need to think about as well. So we've got this is sort of divided into two bits, really. The first bit is to do with field capture, cameras, etc. But then the problem and the real challenge is this, and this is the reason why an awful lot of cameras are bought and then discarded, is because people don't know what to do with the images when they've got them. Okay, how do they organize these? How do they share them? Well, obviously there's things in asset management, you know, things, softwares and stuff like ActivePlan and things like which are built around 360. But what do I do if I'm not using that, and how can I share these things? Well, the key thing to think about is what you do in the field to help you with the image organization. So what you're trying to do is figure out, well, where was that photograph taken so I can place it? Which part of the plant room, which deck of the ship, which floor, which room, which flat, whatever. So note taking can be a bit of a chore, but there's a few things you can do to speed that up. Okay, first off is a simple whiteboard. I've got a little whiteboard. It's about 200 mil by about 300 mil. I can write on it. I can say where I am, floor 23, and put that on the floor by the tripod. I can mask that out later on. But it means I've got a simple way of, in the image, of figuring out what it is. But the problem with that is I've got to open the image to figure out where I am. Am I outside? Which door am I outside of? Which flat am I? Whereabouts in the plant room, etc. Wouldn't it be a better idea if you didn't have to open the image at all? Well, that's what I spent a lot of time trying to figure out. So there's a number of ways you can do that. And the most important one that I use is, in my phone, I've got a dictation machine. Okay. And the interesting thing about the dictation app is it's time-stamped. So I can have a look at the timestamp, and if that is synced with the timestamp in my camera, I know when I'm taking a note which image that refers to. Now, this will save you hours and hours and hours of time. Trust me, it's what a fundamental thing that I do when I'm doing big 360 projects. All right. Second bit is, if you're doing that, you've got to come up with some basic image organization, like naming conventions. There's no point calling it AWR, JPEG 2345. That's meaningless. What you can do later on is you can hack, or you can actually rename those files in some of the image processing software. Or if you're tethered, you can rename it on the fly. And you could tether it to your mobile phone or your iPad. There's all sorts of interesting ways of doing it. But you've got to come up with some naming convention that helps make sense. What floor is it? What space is it? Whatever the convention is, whether that relates to your BIM model, whether that relates to some other naming convention that your client has, classroom number, ward number, etc. If you do that and then you use that with a dictation, you'll find that you can get through and sort your images much more quickly. But the other thing you can do as well, excuse me, is you can use what we call culling tools. And there are a number of tools that are designed really for professional photographers, but I've figured out some hacks for these. So if I'm a wedding photographer, okay, and I've got hundreds of photographs, I also want to categorize them into the groom, the bride, the bridesmaids, mother-in-law, whatever. Okay, well, all the image in editing software, as we mentioned, allow you to apply that sort of naming convention as either a name or as a tag or as a group. So what I do is I've hacked a sort of the wedding photography tools where they've got taken thousands of photographs, or, you know, if I'm taking photographs of products for a magazine, for an e-commerce site, I have to be able to sort those. So all I'm doing is hacking those types of tools, but applying conventions, meta tagging, grouping to those. And I could explain a bit more about it, but if I've got more time, but I've only got an hour. But we come back to that, and we can talk about that in future workshops as well. Okay, so the key for us really is to talk about this wonderful subject called metadata. Metadata allows us to search what I call unstructured information. So the conventional way that we look at managing images is to put them into different projects and folders and files, and that's great. But it's really slow, because if we're trying to find something, we're basically limited by the name the person who created that folder called it. Now, the beauty of metadata, of course, is we can apply lots of different labels to the same thing. So the analogy I use is I go fly fishing, and I've just bought a book on fly fishing in North Wales. So if I was to categorize that and put it into my folder, my conventional folder, or let's say my library, where would I put it? Would I put it in a folder on hobbies? Would I put it on a folder on fly fishing? Would I put it on a folder of North Wales? The beauty of metadata is I can put it, a copy or a virtual copy, into all those areas. So that means that I'm able to find things. Now, this becomes really important because 360 imagery is, the other thing I call it is knowledgement. My website is called knowledgement because that's essentially what we're doing. We're managing the knowledge, and we're managing the knowledge in these 360 imagery. And to do that, we need to have some certain procedures. Like, for example, number one thing is developing a taxonomy. How do we categorize these? You know, if I've got a room, if it's to do with fire equipment, is it what sort of fire damper is it? Blah blah blah. What sort of fire extinguisher might it be? What sort of fire alarm? What sort of thing? So I need to come up with taxonomies, and taxonomies can also mean different people call different things different things in different countries. A taxonomy allows us to use synonyms and misspellings and things like that to help us find us, and that allows us to develop a tagging and classification ontology, which means that we can tag things, or in 360, we may have 20 different assets, okay? But we can't just apply one tag to that. But the beauty of meta tagging is we can apply as many as we want. And that comes on to, all of these bring me to my favorite word at the moment, which is findability. How do we find stuff? Okay, you may have thousands and thousands of photographs on your hard drives separated across your organization, okay? And these are really valuable. I may want to go back and say, well, where's the photograph of that thing before we fixed it? And because we've got a new photograph, so we need to compare it. How do I find that? The interesting thing about your organization, and if you want to make your boss look good, and this isn't me saying this is big consultancy companies like Gartner and McKinsey, say that in any knowledge-based organization, at least 25% of the daily hours are spent looking for information. So metadata allows you to cut that time down. Now, if you went to any CFO or CEO and say, look, we're wasting 25% of our productivity trying to find stuff, and incidentally, 1 in 4 times you won't find it. If you went to your CFO and CEO and said, look, we're wasting all this time, how big are you? They're just going to hand you their checkbook, because this is crucial to productivity in your organization, productivity in the UK, productivity in the health service, whatever organization.
Barry, could you just pause for a second? Right, I'm just concerned that some people may need to start dropping off because we're coming up to the hour. What I just wanted to make sure that people are aware that we've got 2 follow-up sessions next week, on Thursday at 9:30 and on Friday at 9:30, where we can look at, as what Barry's saying here, the practical implementation of this. So having gone through this brilliant overview, if you want to come and actually you want to come along and get together either on Thursday or Friday at 9:30, put your name in the or put Thursday or Friday in the chat now, and then we can invite you. Sorry, Barry, I'll hand back.
No, that's fine, George. Yeah, good idea, because I was coming to that slide, but there won't be people jumping off for lunch and stuff. That's no problem. Right, so for me, the 360 imagery, there are 2 aspects to it, and I sort of specialize in 2 ends. One is the image quality, how do you get the best, but also findability. How do you make these images so you can use them? Because you know, you might have great quality images, but if you can't find the right image, it's pointless taking it, isn't it? Okay, so jumping on, how do we get these images into your system? How do you get it into your Excel spreadsheets? How do you do it? Well, there are a number of routes to it, and depending on what you want to do, but the three key things that you can use are so geotagging. So if I take photographs outside, you may or may not know that all the photographs you take are geotagged. Whether if it's an Apple or an Android, you can add that to your photograph in what we call EXIF data. So every photograph you take, and this is how the magic of Apple and Google phones work, is suddenly get a collection of all the photographs when you're on your, you know, you went to get fish and chips at Scarborough. Suddenly they're all grouped together. Well, that's because we're using a thing called geotagging. Now that's great because it works where you've got a satellite signal. So you can use it with GNSS or GPS if you want to call it that. Okay, now that's great, but what do I do about doing it inside? I mean, where I've got no satellite coverage, how do I locate all these images? Well, the good news is that you can do that. There are routes, and well, you could do it manually, but there are now systems to allow you to do that automatically. We can go that's a big subject, but trust me, it is entirely possible for you to automate these things. Because you can use it you can use photogrammetric software to calculate what we call the camera poses. A camera pose is where is this in X, Y, and Z, and also what we call pitch, yaw, and roll, phi, beta, and kappa. So we can actually orientate the image and say where is it in a coordinate system, whether that's a National Grid Ordnance Survey type coordinate system, or whether it's the coordinate system that you're using for your Revit model or whatever. You can do that. And you can automatically position. So one click and it will lay out all those images for you in the exact position where you're going to do. So that's one way of doing it. Or you could do it the old-fashioned way, or you could build your own 3D tour. There's lots of different ways of doing it. The point is you can do it. Don't let that scare you. Because one of the things people say is, I've got 1,000 images of this paper mill. How do I populate it? Well, you can do it manually, and to be honest, it's a pain in the derriere to do that. The benefits will probably work it out, but you've got to have some subject matter expertise, and it's really difficult for people who didn't do the photographs to actually do that back in the office. Okay, that's one of the tips I would say. Don't have a field crew who don't populate these, otherwise you're just going to spend most of the time with images and no one knows where they are, and they're next to useless. Okay. All right, moving on to the next bit. What was that? The next bit. Right. Okay. And really what I wanted to do is, just before we go into the Q&A bit, is talk about what do we do next with this stuff, because the applications for 360 imagery are just mental. I mean, we're talking about it in asset management. And in that course, we could say it's digital asset capture. We're starting from scratch. We have no information about this building. It might be that we've got no handover documentation. It might be just because of its age, all sorts of things. How do we build up a digital asset capture strategy? Well, 360 imagery is a really good way of doing it. It's cost effective, it's immediate, it doesn't require much in the way of IT head scratching. It's really straightforward. Then we've got things like what we call asset validation. So we're checking off things against what's been installed. You know, the BIM model, the designer, the architect, the MEP, people might be saying what really went in. Okay, so it's like we're not so much using it for, say, clash detection, like, say, LiDAR scanning or conventional site documentation would be for new build. It's just a record of what has gone on that anyone can use. We can also use it with different camera systems and things to do condition surveys. I mean, I'll show you in a second a brief example of the level of detail that you can get with these. But if I want to look at dilapidation, if I want to look at handover for leases, if I want to look at remediation, if I want to look at facilities management, condition surveys are the be all and end all. And the beauty of 360 is it covers every surface and it's non-negotiable. That is what you've got. Okay, if I'm looking at paying an invoice and I want to query that invoice, I've got a photograph that's saying, no, well, you didn't fill that crack that we asked you to. How much time does that save? So you can use it for things like digital asset assessment, and whether that's part of a maintenance plan, whether that's part of a procurement, commercial, PFI delivery, all sorts of different things. All right, one of the other interesting aspects you can talk about is operation, the O&M manuals. Building 360 imagery into this is a much simpler way than typing reams and reams of documents that hardly anyone understands anyway. But the beauty of these is that you can connect these assets to manuals, to product descriptions, to all sorts of different things that you want to, because the 360 model is like a knowledge portal. You can navigate around it and attach information to the photograph. So you can link manuals, drawings, certifications, inspections, invoices, even emails. And interestingly, you can link all these to one of the things I haven't put is linking to SharePoint. If your organization uses SharePoint, you can link from the 360 imagery to documents and search using the meta searching engine that SharePoint has. You can use the same taxonomy, by the way, but that's another story. There are other things to do with specific applications, like, say, fire risk assessments, because one of the things now is that many people, councils are responsible for people's personal evacuation things, because if you've got somebody with limited mobility in one of your properties, then that person might need a specific evacuation procedure. Where do they go? So you can use it to help plan those, communicate with the people, all sorts of different things. There's a massive, massive application for 360 in health and safety in terms of looking at risk assessment, looking at everything. One of the key things that you could do, something like it's going off slightly a little bit, is looking at railway access points. Most of the accidents that happen on the railway happen at access points. On the rail, not necessarily. You have two types of accident: you trip or you're hit by a train. Okay, but a lot of the injuries happen at, people need to navigate. What's this access point look like? Has it got stairs? Can I take my tools and people down there? But it applies right across the construction sector and right across the facilities management rule as well, sector too. One of the areas I'm particularly interested in is two things now, which are sort of linked in many ways. But so I'm using this 360 imagery for mapping disability access. What's state, whatever limitations I might have, if I'm a wheelchair user, can I get to around this university campus? And interestingly enough, there's another one that's come up, which is to do with neural diversity. Some people need quiet routes to get to and from the railway station or the shops and things like that. So one of the things you can use 360 imagery for is that, and then share it. Because the beauty of this, you can put it onto a website, you can make it available to everyone. You don't have big point clouds and things like that to deal with. The other thing that's coming up is to do with what we call, is to do with the incoming, what's going to probably be a massive impact for us is Martin's Law. The regulations that have come out of the Manchester bombing. The Martin's Law has royal assent, but it's going to take a bit of time to recruit the team to do it. But basically, what every venue over 800 people now has to have a series of documentation and training for its stewards and staff. That's what happens in the case of a terrorist attack. Now, this isn't an option. Okay, this isn't a would like. It's a would like if you have an audience of less than 800. But anything like a football stadium or a bingo hall, well, maybe not bingo halls, probably, but something like that, or a church or any event which has more than 800 people, have to, when people are assessing it. At the moment it's law, and the law says we are going to set up this regulatory authority to do this. It's probably sometime late this year, next year, every venue is going to have to comply with this. And 360 is one way of doing it. And then the thing I've been doing for a lot is actually like the ultimate, I call in asset management, or I call this DIM, decommissioning information management, rather than BIM. Because we have a process in nuclear decommissioning called characterization, which means that every single object that's in a nuclear plant that's going to be decommissioned needs to have a waste disposal protocol. Can I just throw it in the bin? Or do I have to bury it in in a cave for 500,000 years? So that is the ultimate tool in asset management, because you've got to do an audit of every single point. And the best way we found of doing it is not drawings. It's not an Excel spreadsheet. It's 360 imagery linked to a database, like Active Plan or any of the other 360 tools that are out there. Okay. So those are applications. What we were going to do is we're going to run a couple of extra application workshops next week, which is George has just mentioned, just for an hour or so, just to talk about how you can do this, because this is such a big topic. And to be honest, it's crucial, because 360 images are lovely to look at, but you can use them for so many different things. So we're running these next Thursday and Friday, 9:30 to 10:30. As George said, just put Thursday or Friday in if you want to. And then you can join us and we can talk in more detail about those. I'm going to stop there because I realize I've got a lot of information. Just one last thing before we leave. From next Friday, I'm going to be starting what I call 360 boot camps. We've just touched on this. So if you want to get in touch with me or through George or anybody, but if you want to email me at Barry the Rich Pixel, I'll send you some more information about those. Okay, so going back to questions, I'm sure there's a lot, and I'm just going to stop sharing now, and so you can see my face again. Hello, guys. Right, and I'll have a look in the chat and see what questions you've got. Okay, right, so we've got some questions here. Right, so Dan Hugan, 360 imagery replaces human inspection. Almost always doesn't get in close enough for most types of inspection. Sorry, Dan, no, that's not right. Yeah, I can get down to 0.1 of a millimeter.
Barry, could you you did promise you were going to show something. I think that would be really good if you've got,
okay.
if you've got
Yeah.
an example.
Yeah, okay. Let me have a look. Let me just share the screen again. Sorry. Yeah, hold on a minute.
I think it's often a misconception. That was my reason for saying it.
Okay. Let's have a look. I need to get rid of the text thing. Hold on, chat. I'll get back to.
If you're not ready, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
No, it's okay. I'll show you. I'll show you an example when we're talking about you can't get close enough. So it's probably opportune to that question, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see a church?
Yeah.
Okay. So when people say you can't get good quality out of these images, so this is actually my local church. I just thought I'd throw it up for you. But we can navigate round with 360. Now this is done with a multi-shot camera. If I zoom in here, okay, and I've got a limited zoom, but if I wanted to get closer, I could take another photograph closer. But if I go to something like this and zoom in and zoom out, you can get good enough. If you pick the right camera, you can use it for inspection. Okay, does that make sense? The other thing I'd point out as well is what we're coping with here is all this area here was not very, was in shade. And I'll show you another example that I've got. Can you see a black screen now then, George? Everyone?
No, we're still seeing the church.
Oh, okay. I'll have to jump onto another window. I'll come back to that in the question. Okay, but in that, sorry, but you don't need that bit. Right, so with the cameras that I use, you can peer into the shadows because this isn't very well lit. The only light really is coming from the windows here, the stained glass windows. But what I've got is a complete way of navigating and sharing this. If I wanted to show, I mean, this is for a church, but you love the level of detail that you can get in here. When people say you can't get detail from 360, well, it's just because they don't know what they don't know. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a sort of level of detail that we can get. Now, imagine if you could do that across, you don't have to do that all the time, but you could but with the right camera and the right application, you can.
there any
Okay.
more questions?
Yeah, well, I'm just going through the chat and then seeing here. Okay, I'm just saying to great for a client initially.
I don't think there were that
Oh.
many
I
questions.
don't think there were many questions actually, were there? It's mostly people agreeing and then saying Thursday or Friday.
Is it worth me just showing a couple of examples of what has been done, Barry?
If you
Yeah.
want to, George, yeah.
And Barry, can you share a copy of that presentation? Is it possible?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, it's a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah,
so,
it's brilliant. It's really good. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. We're just starting on this subject, and this is sort of like just to get you over a bit of a hump. But
Okay, so here's a couple of practical examples, and we can go into these in a bit more detail. And anybody else that's got them when we meet on Thursday or Friday. So this particular application, what we're using it for is to check that the drawings that are in the secure information box, which is what the fire brigade use, are actually correct. Now, what the 360 photo here has done, it's actually revealed that there's a gap there, a doorway there, that isn't on the secure information box drawings. Now, that's really, really dangerous for the fire service, and they want that sorting out because it really isn't satisfactory. And part of the reason is that the drawings themselves, there's not clarity. There's all these 4 stars of drawings in there. None of them are quite right. What we're also doing is we're putting behind the 360 photos, which I'll show you in a second, a master library of asset types. So by having a master library of asset types, it means that you've got a controlled set of information which then can be connected to lots of other things. So rather than just putting a tag on the 360 photo, what you're actually doing, you're connecting it to a master database, which is interconnected with maintenance information, product information, and all the rest of it. And you'll see here what we've done with this. We've created it so that we've got Uniclass, IFC, we can have NRM. So by what we're trying to do is encourage people to use standardized data sets. The 360 then can then be tagged with the asset types that are in that library. So here we're identifying where there's an AOV and also where there's an actuator. And that's not being tagged in the 360 photo, it's actually being tagged in the database. So all those assets are now related to that space. So you can pick up where the dry risers are, for example, and also what's in an electrical cupboard. So this information is in the database. So you can then go to the database as a schedule, click on it, and it remembers where that particular asset was in the building. So that's where Barry comes back to Barry's findability thing. This one here is an integration with OpenSpace, which is one of the leading applications that are used by the construction teams. And what it's doing, it's recording exactly what's there. So then the asset teams are then using that to then verify what has been provided. And again, on the right-hand side there, we've got the validation of what's in the room, and then you can go and check it, and it's updating that. And in this example, it's the findability is being used to find the fire dampers. So the fire dampers there, we've got the 3D model, but we actually want to see where that fire damper is, what the product is. In this case, it's connected back to a product library. And the product library also has the information about maintenance. So that means it's only collected once. And it can also generate a very simple maintenance view of that item, and then be able to connect that back to the 360 photo. So here, that's connecting it directly back to the 360 photo. and therefore you can also tie that back to the manufacturer's product information, including any documents about that item. So rather than having to just have those in the O&M manual, they're actually connected to the asset as well. So again, it makes findability much easier.
George,
Number-
just one quick question on this. Sorry
Yeah,
for jumping
sure.
in. And it relates to what Barry said about automated positioning of photographs. Using that technology, could you potentially auto-generate this? Once you've set up your taxonomy in your software, could you generate this tagging within the system?
That's what we're working towards, Brian.
Yeah.
So what we've now done 140,000 asset types or assets. So we're using that. That's quite a lot in a large language model, but it's not quite enough yet to do that automatically. But it's semi-automatic. Yes, it will be.
Just to say, there are things that I've been working on to do with AI identification of defects and crack propagation, for example, where we're using this in some nuclear applications to see how cracks are moving.
Yeah.
So the AI thing is changing the game. I hate the word game changer, but it is, because it's going to make an awful lot of things much simpler. The key thing, though, is you've got to take photographs of it. Otherwise, it can't work by itself.
Exactly.
It needs some sort of images to generate that. And if you're going to do that, you need the best quality images you're going to get, so the AI doesn't give you lots of false positives and identify things that are not right. Because the whole point of it is it will do a lot of automated tasks, but you still don't want to have any manual intervention. So understanding how you can take good quality photographs that are appropriate to the asset. There's no point taking photographs if you're doing little bits of pipe work, because you need to get in a bit closer to see it. Otherwise, it just looks like spaghetti. So it's more to do with so the quality of the image that you take and understanding that is going to be critical to the success of those things, I'd say.
I think absolutely. And the other thing, Brian, is that the reason we're being able to do what we're doing is that we're using libraries.
Yeah.
So because we're using database libraries, it means that you can get that repeatability that you need. My development team tell me that you need at least 100 images of a particular asset that have been captured and recognized by an expert to say it's one of those. For every single asset type. And we've got in our library, we've got about 3,500 asset types that we can work with. This is just the one final thing. This is just showing how the drawings, for example, you need to prepare. You can prepare a spatial model from existing O&Ms. So this is working on the basis of that's the drawings of the compartment walls. You've then got the schedules of the doors, so we can then combine the two things together in the database, and therefore we've then got a plan view that has got the 60-minute walls, the 120-minute walls. We've then got the doors that are protecting them, and then we've got the 360s that have been dropped in. So in this case, in this nursing home, the assets are tagged, but also you can then use that to do the condition assessment. So again, that comes back again to the quality of the image. But what it can do is substantially speed up the process. And in this particular case, we've been working with the HSE so that we can then make that so it's also tagging back to the Uniclass risk matrix. So those are just some use cases that we can talk about. We've got quite a few more that we can talk about on Thursday or Friday. And if you can come along to the meeting with maybe some examples of things that you're doing, or just ideas as to the art of the possible. I think, being able to have a 360 fire risk assessment, for example, has got a lot of potential, because fire risk assessments aren't necessarily that easy to understand after they've been handed over. Whereas combining that with 360s probably would be helpful.
Okay, thank you, George. I think that what George has shown is sort of like the elegant solutions we can apply in terms of productivity and things. I'd just like to point out that you can just use 360 in a really simple way as well. And sometimes that is a way of conveying information, whether that's, I'll give you one last example where we're using it. And when that is one water authority now is using 360 tours as part of their tender documentation, because they're embedding that in the tender documentation so people can get a much better view of the conditions and all sorts of things. And it means people are not they're not having to second guess or build in contingencies because they've not been able to do a site visit. Two things have happened with that. The first one is that the value or the cost for the tenderee or the person doing the tender has dropped by about 25%. The second thing is the overall price has dropped by about 12% for similar contracts, because people don't have to put the contingency factor in. They know what they're walking into, and they get a much better immersive from 360 immersive. They get a much more important view, and it's not a complicated thing. It's just a few 360s can make all the difference at the beginning of a project and at the end, as we're using it in decommissioning in nuclear too. So, and that's all I wanted to say. We've got these follow-up things next Thursday and Friday. If you're interested, I'll be announcing these new boot camps as well, because it seems to me that there's a big market and a big need for people to understand, maybe not just you guys, but your colleagues in other parts of your organization need to be made aware of what 360 imagery can deliver cost effectively as a way of communication, clarity and stuff like that. So thank you very much for your time and staying awake. That's great. We had something like 60, 70 people on board. And thank you for your kind comments in the chat as well. Look forward to seeing you next Thursday.
Hang on, Gordon's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry,
Barry,
Gordon.
just very briefly, you're talking about asset information potentially coming from other devices feeding into the 360. Obviously, I've got a vested interest in that in the sense of water quality and corrosion control, or water quality and Legionella management. But if you've got live sensors, how does that kind of apply into 360? Because can we API that kind of live data in so you can actually transact live with the system internal data?
Yeah, we're talking about something. Well, we're talking about well, people's definition of a digital twin depends which company you're working for and what you're trying to sell.
Sure.
I think.
Sure.
But there is no problem with embedding. So you can embed tags into that, which is if you've got an Internet of Things device, then you can embed a link to that and have that as a pop-up system. We've done that. In actual fact, I can't. I'd have to kill you after I've told you, because it's, but basically that's what we're doing in the nuclear field. Is we've got sensors, temperature sensors feeding into the 360 imagery, which is a live update. Provided you've got an IP address of things, you can link anything to these 360 imagery. Because the beauty of it is you're not necessarily put into a 3D coordinate. It's a 2D image on a screen.
Yeah,
and
remember
it's the URL.
Our device is mildly different than that, but we can have a maybe chat about that at some stage and actually demo that kind of stuff again.
Yeah, Gordon, that's essentially what we're doing. So within ActivePlan, the 360 is in the asset database with its coordinates, so that because our database is SQL Server, it can talk with anything. So
just one live example that I'm working on, Gordon, is this sounds weird. Well, it sounded weird, but it's actually in schools for monitoring levels of carbon dioxide in classrooms, because in afternoon they've realized carbon dioxide reduces learning capabilities. People fall asleep, drowsy. So what we're doing there is, rather than construct they've got a Revit model. Okay, so they need to look at the volumes and air shift and things like that for ventilation. But the simple way to actually design it with these 360 imagery and then click on that, and that's where the monitors are. So they actually use that for maintenance of the monitors rather than the Revit model. They can feed that information into their Revit flow models, airflow models and stuff like that. So they've got a live dynamic fluid, whatever you call it. It's way beyond my pay grade. But essentially, that's what you're doing, and it's a sort of similar sort of thing you're talking about, remote
Sure.
monitoring.
Sure. Good,
Okay,
thank you. Sorry.
no problems. Anybody else got any questions before we hang up?
If you've got other people that you think may be interested in this, let us know and we'll send them a link to the recording.
Oh yeah, do that. Okay, guys, I think that's all I wanted to say. And go and have your lunch and enjoy your Friday and your early dart if you have one, Poets Day. But yeah, if it is, and look forward to seeing you next week. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, please feel free to email me or find me on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to share what I know.
Thanks, Barry. Cheers.
Okay, guys, you take care. Have a great weekend.